my name is Beck and welcome to a spoiler-free review for Rogues, which is edited by George R. R. Martin and Gardner Dozois. The way this review is going to work is I'm going to talk about each individual short story, so if you want to skip to a particular story and you don't want to hear about every single one, I will leave a breakdown in the comments so you can skip ahead at your leisure. So just before we get into me talking about my thoughts about each of these stories, I just want to say quickly that the title Rogues is really the prompt that each of these writers responded to, and Rogues kind of refers to the characters in books that don't really follow the rules. So it might be the rogue detective who goes off the books and interrogates suspects and gets a result that's positive at the end, or it's kind of like an Indiana Jones character. It's like Alex Stern in Ninth House. So they're kind of a fairly unpredictable and almost aloof character in a narrative, and they are often my favourite characters in a book as well. So let's get into what my thoughts are for each of these short stories. The first one is by an author that I'm really enjoying at the moment. It is by Joe Abercrombie and it's called Tough Times All Over, and you can definitely read this if you haven't read his First Law series, but I think if I'd gone into reading this short story before reading his other books, then I wouldn't have connected with it and enjoyed it as much as I did. I can't decide on giving this a 3.5 stars or a 4 stars. I might sit on a comfortable 3.5. This is about a myriad of characters that you get introduced to really slapdash and really quickly, but because I knew about some of them from his past writing, then it was just nice to push back the curtain and be like, oh, I know that, I know that, I know that. And it was nice to see a few of them again. But they were tracking this magical item, and then that magical item gets into the hands of the wrong person. So the rogue has to get it back, essentially. I loved that this story was narrated by Gwendolyn Christie, who plays Brienne of Tarth in Game of Thrones. I just found that awesome to hear her voice in an audiobook for a fantasy. I found that really cool, so that was just like a little side note. I loved that. There was a character or two from Best Served Cold, and it happens before Best Served Cold starts, but after The Last Argument of Kings, which is the third book in his First Law series, or trilogy rather. So probably don't read this story before you'd read the First Law series, because you'll be spoiled in terms of the trajectory of one of the characters from the First Law series, and we don't want any spoilers because that is a great series. But overall, I enjoyed this first story. It was a really great opener, and I don't really have anything negative to say about it other than I wish it kind of settled in one place. But at the same time, on the other end of that, I enjoyed that it was constantly moving. So I'm pretty much rating this mostly on my enjoyment factor of it. The next story in here was by Gillian Flynn, who is the author of Gone Girl. So she's not necessarily a fantasy author, but she responded to the prompt. And her story is called What Do You Do? And that's in reference to the character in this who essentially performs sexual favors for men, but also on the flip side of that, in the same studio, does psychic readings for people, like anybody who walks in. And she gets a woman who's a walk-in and is really, really concerned about her son, who seems to be a psychopath or a sociopath. And we end up going to this woman's house, and it all unravels from there. And I don't want to give any kind of indication of which way this goes, because I actually loved this short story. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and I didn't realize that I would adore it so much. This can basically be described as a con artist, a wife, and a haunted house, and that's all you need to know going into it. So I would highly encourage you to pick up this book just to read that story, because it was definitely my favourite of the entire book, and I didn't expect my favourite to be not a fantasy author, so that was a really nice surprise. I really like the twist in here. I think it was incredible, and I just unexpectedly loved this. Unfortunately, the next story, which is by Matthew Hughes, called The Inn of the Seven Blessings, I think. Yeah, I unfortunately gave this a 2 out of 5 stars. It was fairly lackluster to me, and it was one of the lower points in this book for me, unfortunately. It follows a thief named Rattalon, and I think that's how I pronounce his name, and he accidentally stumbles onto a magical item where a deity can communicate directly into his head, and whoever's touching this magical item has communications directly with the deity, and the deity can also take over their body while this touch bond is in place. So it had the potential to be fairly slapstick and a little bit funny, as well as being dire, because I believe they're trying to steal something back, but unfortunately I was just a little bit disappointed. I wasn't very gripped by this story, and the main character, I was on board with him until he mentioned one of the women that he ended up saving in this story, and he made advances on her, and then she rejected him, and he considered taking her virtue, and I was just like, ooh, that's not really a fantasy book that I want to read, or a character that I want to get behind. I felt this was a very traditional fantasy in terms of how gender was approached and how women were sexualized, but the main character was up on a pedestal a little bit. So that's why I only ended up giving it a 2 out of 5 stars. The next story in here is called Bent Twig by R Lansdale. I'm not sure if this author is a fantasy author in general, because this story in here wasn't a fantasy either. It followed 2 cops that I believe he's revisited because they're in one of his main series, so this is just kind of like a little side mission or side story for them. The characters are called Hop and Leonard, and this was very much a damsel in distress story about them trying to upend a drug cartel in their local city, and it was very southern. It had southern accents, and the narrator reading this was very much from Texas. It was a fairly cliche cop short story, and I didn't dislike it, but I didn't love it. I just kind of enjoyed it the way you'd put on an episode of an old TV show and just have it on in the background. That's kind of how I felt about this story. So it was very kind of NCIS but Texas. And I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars because it was just good. It wasn't bad or particularly dry in any means. The next story is Tawny Petticoats, and that's by Michael Swanwick. And unfortunately, like the Matthew Hughes one, I didn't love this story either, and kind of for similar reasons. This followed 2 characters named Surplus and Dodger, and they're looking for a very specific person with a very specific tattoo, and this kind of links into their overall heist trajectory of the story, so I won't say what happens there, but this is set in a sci-fi world where people are essentially made into zombies and then used as slaves, and I thought that would be a really interesting key point to investigate, but they kind of took a back seat to the woman that came in with this tattoo. I wanted to get really invested, but the thing that I was invested in was kind of off in the blurry distance, unfortunately. I found the zombies to be a good parallel for the workers in the working week and just being completely hazed out, but like I said, they weren't really touched on too much. They did come into it a little bit, but they weren't touched on in a major way, and as somebody who loves zombie stories, I just feel a little bit robbed. But again, this is like the Matthew Hughes story. The gender roles were fairly typical. It was a fairly traditional kind of sci-fi, and while I didn't dislike the ending, I just didn't really vibe with the story overall, and I didn't really like the portrayal of one of the characters, so I gave this another 2 out of 5 stars. Next, we have a story by David W. Ball, and this one is called Provenance. And this one is about an old art curator named Max, and he receives a mysterious letter to investigate this long lost painting. And I found myself tuning in and out for this part of the audiobook. I just, again, didn't connect with this part. So I found this so far started really strong and then kind of dwindled off a little bit. This was very much a languish and throwback to an artist named Beck, and all of the escapades that he got involved with and the war and the controversy. And it could have been interesting, but it just felt like someone had sat down, opened a history book and was reading me word for word what was happening in that book. I didn't really connect with it very much, and I wasn't very empathetic, I guess. Again, maybe because this seemed like it was a little bit historical, even if the characters in it weren't even real at all. That might be why I checked out of it a little bit, because historical fiction is not really for me. And in my notes I've said it is okay but not amazing, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. The next one is by Carrie Vaughn, and it's called Roaring Twenties, and it's a sci-fi, and I've written in my notes that I found the first line amazing, so I thought I'd just read it to you. It says, "The good thing about Blue Moon is that it's invisible, so it never gets raided," which just sounds really cool because it sets everything up for the reader within like a sentence. So I know it's a sci-fi, I know they're on this mysterious planet, and I know that there's a threat of raiders or of criminals, which is mostly what you need to understand about this short story, I guess. So this was just a really cool foray into the meeting of sci-fi and fantasy. So we follow 2, I think they're witches, and they're in this bar which can't seemingly be accessed by the mundane everyday person. You have to have magic or some kind of passcode to get in, and this detective has managed to get himself in, and these 2 witches aren't really sure how, but they're in the middle of trying to pull off a heist. And I really loved the aspects of fantasy that we got in here. So the singer in the bar is a siren, and there are different magical creatures. There are creatures with horns and scales and all that kind of thing. And I really liked the dynamic between the 2 main characters. So we see from the character Pauline, who is an assistant, and Madame M is basically the witch or the magician that Pauline is the assistant to. And I just wanted more. I wanted more from this this story, which is a good sign. I just wanted to dive into a novel-length version of these two characters who are trying to make a living out of using their magic, but in a secret way, because I think they're kind of trafficking and smuggling people to safer places. It was just a great little story, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, so it definitely started to pick up for me. The next story was by Scott Lynch, and I haven't loved his stuff historically. I gave The Lies of Locke Lamora about a 3 stars, so I was a little bit hesitant to go into this one, but I ended up liking it and it was okay. So this one was called A Year and a Day in Old Therodon, and also it was narrated by Gwendolyn Christie, which made me very interested in reading about it. Our main character in Lynch's short story is named Amaral, and she is essentially a criminal. She's a thief and she's done many a heist before. She's essentially a veteran of heists and thieving, and she is getting drunk with some friends in a bar, and she realizes that someone in her past has given her a bit of a slight. So she goes to their house and basically gets into a very big argument with them, and this person is a bad person to get into an argument with because they have a lot of power and a lot of magic, and that kind of gets Amren and her crew into a worrying situation that they have to do a heist for and solve and get out of it. So it's essentially about blackmail in a fantasy story, and I enjoyed it. I didn't love it again, which I think is a theme going through these stories, except for the Gillian Flynn one. The things that I liked in this story for Scott Lynch were the fact that he included goblins in it, and he also had an automaton character, which was interesting to see as well. But the story I ended up giving about 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I liked it. The next story after Lynch's was called Bad Brass, and it's by Bradley Denton, and this kind of centers on some teens doing a drug deal, or it appears to be a drug deal, and there's this 43-year-old teacher who is watching them do this, and when they have all of their guard down, he sneaks in and steals the money from this drug deal. So it's an interesting rogue situation pitted against these kids who are rogues themselves. I liked that kind of premise, and I didn't expect the main character to do something like stealing money, but I just didn't like him overall. That was probably the only moment that I liked what his character did, and then the rest of the time I just found him boring and ridiculous. And he was talking about his ex-wife, who was also a teacher at the school, and that one of the other teachers was now dating her, and I just didn't care. It just sounded very high school to me. So this one I feel started out fairly strong, and I like the way that it was tied up at the end, but I just didn't like the main character's inner dialogue. I found that a little bit frustrating, so I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5 stars. The next story in here is Heavy Metal by Cherie Priest, and this was kind of an urban fantasy, or maybe it was just straight up fantasy. You followed a character in here that was like 7 foot tall with red hair. I imagined him as kind of a fair version of Hagrid mixed with Jack Reacher. He seemed to be a monster hunter, and I was interested in him, but I just wasn't interested in the story. So the plot was a little bit meh for me, but the character I found really intriguing. So Kilgore, like I said, who is the main character, had to go and investigate this creature that is attacking people or stealing people from this town. And again, didn't enjoy the trajectory of the story, but I liked the characterization. I liked the potential for magic in here, and I liked the potential for monsters as well. And I think I wanted more in this world because I found it very interesting, and I wanted more of Kilgore interacting with the world so I understood more things, but I just didn't like the plot of this one, so I think I gave it about a 3 out of 5 stars as well. It was okay. The story after Kilgore's is called The Meaning of Love by Daniel Abram, and this is, I think, again set in a fantasy setting where there's a prince and his best friend who is a girl, and the prince has seen somebody from afar and just decided to fall in love with them. Well, not just decided, he is convinced that he's fallen in love with this girl. So his best friend is trying to make it so that he gets introduced to this woman, and the one-liner that is in this story is, "It's good to have a friend you can count on," and this didn't go the way I expected it to, and I quite enjoyed the best friend that you get to see from through the eyes from. I don't want to spoil anything, and the reason that I liked this so much was because of a spoiler, so I'm not going to say why, but I just liked the way that this unfolded. I found the prince to be pretty ridiculous, and the way this ended surprised me, and I like that it surprised me. It was a bit of a surprise and then a sobering ending rather than a this is going the way I expected ending, which is fairly vague, but just know I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and it's worth reading. And now the next one is by Paul Cornell, and it is called A Better Way to Die, and I believe this author is the writer of a few Wolverine comics, and I love Wolverine. So when that was mentioned in his author bio in the audiobook, I just looked up and I was like, so excited. This was a multi-dimensional sci-fi about a character named Jonathan Hamilton who either goes back in time or his younger self is brought forward in time, and it's about his now self interacting with his past self, and he's making all these observations about how things have changed and the things he did then that he wouldn't have done now. So I think that introspectiveness of the story was interesting, but I didn't really connect with the setting that they were in, and even though it was sci-fi, I thought there would be a little bit more lavishness from the world, but there wasn't really much of that. It was just mostly this character, and it seemed a little bit dry to just constantly get his narration. And in addition to that, I found it a little bit difficult to keep track of the plot. This character didn't seem to have a lot of interaction with things around him, so I just found this story to escalate to a point and then it just plateaued for me. So I ended up giving this, I think, a 3 out of 5 stars as well. It kind of just got to a certain point and then was okay. The next story is by Stephen Saylor, and this is called Ill Seen in Tyre. This was set to the backdrop of 2 characters having mead in a bar, and it was set in Roman times, and they're talking about these past battles because there's a painting on the wall that inspires all these memories, and it was essentially a historical supernatural fiction with a magical curator of these paintings. And I liked it enough, but it gave me a little bit of secondhand embarrassment. Can't really love a book that just does that to me for most of it. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I like the characters' interaction in this, but I just didn't really care for them talking about stuff that wasn't necessarily happening to them right then. I wanted more interaction in their current situation rather than them lamenting on stuff that had already happened. So 3.5 out of 5 stars. Again, just enjoyed it. The next story in here is by Garth Nix, and it's called A Cargo of Ivories. So you're following these 2 characters who, I think one is a puppet and one is a human being, and they run into this woman who's also a thief in the same house trying to steal the same thing they are. So it was a very odd set of bantering and circumstance, so I liked it for its uniqueness. I've written here in my notes housebreaking and surprises, and that really sums up the story. And Garth Nix has this way of writing that seems to be a constant loop, and I think his writing is fairly similar to what I've read of Neil Gaiman, and I can't connect with, or I just can't get traction on Neil Gaiman's writing for some reason. I don't know why. It's just not palatable to me, and it really frustrates me if you couldn't tell. And Garth Nix is fairly similar. So one of the lines that he's written is, "He didn't lie, but also didn't tell the truth." And to me, that's just lying. So just say your character lied. So there were little bits in the story like that I tripped me up a little bit, but because it was an audiobook and I wasn't physically reading it, I didn't notice it as much. So just because this one was a little bit weird and a little bit different, I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars because I liked that about it, but it just was a little bit nonsensical at the same time. The next one is called Diamonds in Tequila, and it's by Walter Jon Williams, and this is about a big time movie star, and he's trying to film this movie, and while this is happening, he's also doing drugs with his friends who are part of the movie and they're part of the crew. And they're in Mexico and there's this whole mafia situation, and the movie kind of takes a backseat to the fact that his life is becoming kind of like a movie and it's very unreal. There's been a murder and he's trying to clear his name from it, and he's a fairly roguish kind of character, so he doesn't do the right thing. And I liked that because he didn't do the right thing, it made me not know where the plot was going, but I also just didn't like him either. He didn't really seem to have any redeemable qualities. So I liked that it became a murder mystery, which was interesting, but I didn't really care about the movie plot or anything. And that kind of starts at the beginning and then fades into a murder plot and then goes back into a movie plot closer to the end. So the movie aspect didn't really grip me, but the murder mystery part did. So I gave this about a 2.5 stars and maybe a 3 out of 5. Next is a story by Phyllis Eisenstein, and it's called The Caravan to Nowhere, and this followed a minstrel, a travelling minstrel, which is something that I love because Name of the Wind is one of my favourite books, and Quoth in that book is essentially a travelling minstrel. So already the premise of this, I was hooked, but this travelling minstrel has a superpower where he can teleport himself, which just sounds absolutely incredible, and that is what sold me on devouring this section of the book. However, while Alaric can transport himself, this was set up very early in the plot, but then it wasn't really touched on again until near the end. And I thought that was going to be the main thrust of the story, the fact that he had this ability and he was also a travelling minstrel and he had this air of mystery to him. But that wasn't really the case. It kind of talked about this guy going on this quest with a bunch of people on this caravan, and it ended up literally being a caravan to nowhere, and there was magic that was actually drugs and people got high, and it was just not what I thought it would be. And I think because I was set up to think it was one thing and it turned out to be another, that's why I was a little bit disappointed. I wasn't disappointed in the sense that I didn't like it, I was disappointed in the sense that I was just confused for some of the story. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I can't give it a 4 and I can't give it a 2, so it's just going to have to be a 3. The next story is by Lisa Tuttle and it's called The Curious Affair of Dead Wives, and I thought this was actually really intriguing because it involved 2 characters in the 1800s, I think, in London, and they're investigating this crime. So it was very similar to Stalking Jack the Ripper, and I recently read Capturing the Devil, the last in that series, and loved it. So that kind of vibe really appeals to me. The historical detective story, kind of like Sherlock, I guess, as well. And that's what this was. So we are seeing from the main character's eyes, and she is the assistant to this man who's a detective. It's not like she's the stupider one or he's the stupider one. Both of them are on equal terms. This girl comes to her one day and says that her sister has gone missing after being in a coma for like days, and she doesn't know what's happened to her. So they buried her body, and then that body has now disappeared. So this is what the character is investigating. And I thought it would delve more into the supernatural aspect that this seems to hint at, but that wasn't really the case. It kind of steered clear away from that. And I think it was doing that on purpose because it needed, or it seemed to need, more space to breathe. And so I'd read a book length of this story, but I felt that the short storyness of it was cut off too short because it seemed to wrap up fairly quickly, and I wanted more from this particular story. This story was a 3.5 stars and I liked it a lot. The next story is by Neil Gaiman and it's called How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, and we know how I feel about Neil Gaiman. I just talked about him before. I find his work a little bit too whimsical, and combined with that, I'm not super interested in fae, so because of that reason I didn't love his short story, unfortunately. It was just about this character who didn't think himself good enough without this coat to supplement his personality, which is a very odd thing to write about. So I liked that aspect of it, but it was very fae-like and it was very tricksy, and I again just don't like fae-like stories. So it was just a 3 out of 5 stars for me. Next up is a story by Connie Willis called Now Showing, and this was set in a kind of sci-fi world, but you don't really get to see too much of the sci-fi world. You mainly see it through the eyes of this character who has just gone through a stressful breakup and she wants to go and see this movie, but this corporation is preventing her from seeing this movie, and she runs into her, of course, she runs into her ex-boyfriend, and he goes through a whole rigmarole of talking with her and kind of excusing the fact that he just randomly up and disappeared in the middle of their relationship. Didn't give her any kind of description whatsoever about why he broke it off or why he left or why he disappeared at all, and that didn't really get investigated very much. It just involved the main character trusting him and going on a little bit of a mini adventure inside this movie theatre to see the right movie with him. And the whole time I was reading it, I was like, why are you trusting him? I found that this girl was trying to equate her life to what a movie was like with all of the plot twists and stuff, but that just equated to the guy withholding information from her. So I wasn't really sold on this story, and I think I wrote in my notes that I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because it was paced well, it was written well, but I just didn't like it, so I might give it a 2 out of 5 stars instead. Next up we have Patrick Rothfuss, one of my favourite authors, and he wrote a story in here called The Lightning Tree, and The Lightning Tree was the reason that I bought this initially, because obviously it's Patrick Rothfuss, and I have been waiting for a 3rd book from him for a very long time, so any chance to devour more of his writing, I was going to buy it, obviously. But his story follows Bast, one of his characters from The Name of the Wind, and you meet Bast in The Name of the Wind at the beginning, and he's kind of helping Quoth in his tavern. But The Lightning Tree follows Bast, so you get to read more from his perspective, and you get to see a little bit of his magic in action, and I liked that aspect of it. So The Lightning Tree is where Bast goes, and that's where all of the kids from the village go to ask him for favours. So when they ask him for a favour, it's kind of like a barter trade system. He gives them stuff and does favours for them if they can give him secrets in return. And I like that when someone was asking him all these questions about the Fae, and he said, they're not like anything. they're like themselves to describe them. I don't know, I just really connected with that line and I thought it worth mentioning because I just really enjoyed it. That said, the ending of this was a little bit open-ended or a little bit left to your imagination, and I wanted a little bit more of a conclusive ending considering the situation that one of the kids was in. I wanted things to end in a way that didn't suggest that things went badly, but I didn't quite get that from this story. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I loved Patrick's writing style. And now we are on to the last story in this collection, and it is by George R. Martin, and it is called Rogue Prince or the King's Brother. And I'm liking A Clash of Kings a lot more than I'm liking the writing in this story. We follow Daemon Targaryen, and what I liked about it was the fact that he is a dragon rider, so you get to see the dragons who are alive and very much part of the society that they're living in. That was the real thing that set it apart from Game of Thrones, and I liked that the most about this story. This really investigates a feud between brothers, and unfortunately it just felt like I was reading a history or a historical account of what actually happened. And I think George R. Martin can kind of get that way in his writing. He's just got so much breadth to this world, so he could very easily write a giant biography for all of his characters in it. And that's kind of what this felt like to me, so it was a little bit dry for my taste, but I am liking A Clash of Kings. So I like his writing, but I like it in his more long form work, and I didn't enjoy it in this one, unfortunately. It just felt a little bit bland and there was a lot of info, but it was okay. And like I've given a few of the other stories in this collection, I've given this story a 3 out of 5 stars. So overall, I added up and then divided to find out what my average rating would be when I was reading this, and it turns out to be about 3.2 stars. So I'd average that up and give it about a 3.5. I really loved Gillian Flynn's story in here. So if you get a chance to at least read Gillian Flynn's story, then please do, because it is so worth the read. And I wish it was published separately so I could go out and buy it and support her. But the stories that I read, like Joe Abercrombie, Patrick Rothfuss, Gillian Flynn, I really enjoyed them and I think it was a worthwhile read. So if you've read this or if you know of a fantasy author that you'd recommend, please let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video and I will catch you in my next one. Bye.